All right, get ready, because today we are really going to dive deep into a case that's, well, it's glamorous and gruesome all at the same time. The Menendez brothers.
Yeah, a story that just seems to capture the imagination, even after all these years.
You guys asked us to go beyond the headlines, peel back the layers, so we're looking at a CBS News article. There's some pretty interesting new evidence there. And of course, the detailed account from biography.com.
Oh, and even BBC News chimed in. They've got a piece on that new Netflix drama. Apparently, Eric Menendez himself has something to say about it.
Yeah, we're definitely going to get to that a little later. But first, let's set the stage. 1989, Beverly Hills. Think excess, right?
I did any of it.
Jose and Kitty Menendez, they had it all.
Yeah.
The mansion, the money, the picture-perfect life.
Or so it seemed.
Because on August 20th, that picture-perfect life, well, it kind of explodes. Jose and Kitty are found murdered in their home.
And it was brutal.
I mean, brutal doesn't even begin to cover it. We're talking 15 shotgun blasts.
The sheer violence of it.
The police, they thought it was a mob hit, right?
Yeah, I mean, who else would do something like that?
Someone wanted them silenced, like, permanently.
And it makes you think the fact that organized crime was the first thing that came to mind, it says a lot about the times, their wealth.
It's like something out of a movie.
Right. The audacity of it all. This kind of violence, it was supposed to stay hidden in the shadows, not out in the open like that, not in Beverly Hills.
And here's the thing. Their sons, Lyle and Eric, they were at the movies when all of this happened. Talk about an alibi.
An alibi that went from airtight to suspicious pretty quickly.
Yeah, because maintaining that facade of innocence, that's pretty tough to do when you go on a pretty insane spending spree right after your parents are murdered.
We're not talking about a little bit of retail therapy here.
No, not at all. Lyle buys a Porsche. Eric. He hires a personal tennis coach.
A tennis coach.
A tennis coach. They burned through almost $700,000 in 6 months.
6 months.
6 months. Not exactly the grieving sons, right?
No, not exactly. And it wasn't just the amount, it was what they spent it on. A Porsche. Come on. Was that Lyle asserting his freedom, or was it something else? Was he running?
Yeah.
And Eric hiring a personal tennis coach. It's like he was trying to create this sense of normalcy.
Or maybe just surround himself with people. Anyone.
Right, to fill that void. These weren't random purchases. It was like looking into their minds, trying to figure out what they were thinking.
So the question becomes, were these the actions of cold-blooded killers, like the prosecution said, driven by greed? Or, and this is where it gets really interesting, was it something else entirely?
Because beneath the surface of this case, this seemingly straightforward case, there's a much darker story. One that would make everyone question everything they thought they knew about the Menendez family.
And that darker story, well, it all revolves around this one word. Abuse.
Because this wasn't just your typical teenage rebellion.
No, not at all. These guys, they alleged years of horrific abuse, and the abuse is at the hands of their father, Jose. We're talking about really disturbing, really graphic accusations.
The kind of accusations that just send shockwaves through the nation. It was like suddenly this picture of the perfect American family, it was gone.
Completely shattered.
Replaced with this really dark story of manipulation and just control.
Yeah, Lyle, he claimed the abuse started when he was just 6 years old, and it lasted for 2 years. Eric's allegations, they were even worse. He said it continued until he was 18, just days before the murders.
It makes you think, doesn't it? If those boys were carrying around that kind of trauma, I mean, it makes you look at everything differently.
It really does. The defense, that was their whole argument, right? Lyle finally confronting his father just days before the murders, that was the tipping point.
They said it created this atmosphere of fear that Lyle and Eric, they were genuinely afraid for their lives.
They believed Jose would do anything to keep them quiet.
And when you consider what they were alleging,
it's not that hard to believe, is it? I mean, think about it. If it was true, his whole life, his reputation, everything, it would have been destroyed.
The defense really painted this picture of 2 young men, trapped, desperate. They said the murders weren't about greed, they were about survival.
And this is where Eric's therapy sessions, they become really important.
Right, because he was already seeing Dr. Oziel before the murders.
What was going on in those sessions? Was he talking about the abuse? Did Oziel have any idea, any inkling of what might happen?
It just added another layer to this whole thing, another layer of complexity. Who were the victims here? Who were the perpetrators? It was almost impossible to tell.
And what about Kitty? She was a victim too. Where does she fit into all of this?
That's the $1 million question, isn't it? Did she know about the abuse?
What does she know?
The defense. They argued that she was complicit, that she knew exactly what was happening, but she turned a blind eye.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it?
They said she was so beaten down emotionally, so lost in her own struggles, that she couldn't even protect her own children.
And that, well, they used that to justify her murder, too. They said it wasn't just about silencing Jose, it was about their own survival. It's hard to wrap your head around that these two young men, they felt like they had to kill their own parents to protect themselves.
It's a lot to process. But the jury in the second trial, they weren't completely convinced.
Because there wasn't enough evidence, right?
Right. The judge said there wasn't enough evidence to support those claims of abuse. And that really hurt the defense's case.
So without that self-defense argument, it all came down to the money.
Exactly. The prosecution, they said it was all about the money. A cold and calculated act of greed. And ultimately, that argument won.
And they were convicted. Right.
Guilty. 2 counts of first-degree murder, sentenced to life without parole. It seemed like that was it. The end of the story.
But it wasn't the end, was it?
No. Because in recent years, some new evidence has come to light. Evidence that makes you rethink everything you thought you knew about this case.
Oh, okay, now you have to tell me more. What kind of evidence? New evidence, you say. I gotta ask, what kind of evidence? After all this time, what could possibly change things?
Well, it's not like a slam dunk.
Yeah.
But it's definitely something. Remember how important those abuse allegations were to the brothers' defense?
Yeah, absolutely.
So get this. There's an affidavit from Roy Russello.
Hold on. Roy Russello. Like from Menudo, Roy Russello.
Yeah, one and only.
No way.
Yeah, it turns out Jose Menendez, he had connections to the band back when he was at RCA Records.
Oh, right.
And Russello, well, he says that Jose Menendez abused him, sexually abused him.
Yeah.
Back then.
Wow. So now you've got someone else, someone completely unconnected to the brothers, saying the same thing about Jose Menendez years later. That's got to mean something, right?
It does. It adds this whole other layer to the story. Because if you believe Russello, it means Eric might be telling the truth. It suggests there was this pattern of behavior, that it wasn't just isolated to the family.
So what happens now? Does this change anything legally?
Well, that's the thing. It hasn't been tested in court.
Yeah.
The DA's office in L.A., they're still looking into it.
So it's a waiting game. But if it's true, I mean, it makes you wonder, could a jury find them guilty if they believed the brothers that they were really afraid for their lives?
It's the question, isn't it? Would it have been enough? Or would the prosecution have found a way, to discredit him like they did with those other witnesses?
It's crazy. Truth is stranger than fiction, right? In this case, it just keeps getting more and more complex. And then you add in the fact that Lyle and Eric, they're still alive. They're still living with what happened. And now their story, it's being told again by Netflix.
Right. Monsters. The Lyle and Eric Menendez story, part of that whole Monsters series. Remember, they did Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah.
Which, that one had its own controversies.
Oh, yeah. People were not happy about that one. A lot of people were saying it was exploitative, that it was trying to make Dahmer seem sympathetic, and he was a monster. So are we going to see the same thing with the Menendez brothers?
Well, there are definitely some parallels. People are already talking about the ethics of it all.
Yeah.
I mean, revisiting this case with the brothers still alive, Lyle and Eric, they're not characters. They're real people.
Living with the consequences.
Exactly. And now, on top of everything else, they've got to deal with Netflix's version of their story, their truth.
I can't imagine to have your life, your pain, everything turned into entertainment. Have they said anything about it?
Eric has. He put out a statement, through his wife. He called the series disheartening slander. Says it's full of distortions and just straight up lies. That it ignores the abuse they suffered.
Wow. It seems like no matter what, the Menendez brothers, their story just won't go away. So where does that leave us? What's the takeaway here?
For me, it always comes back to those original questions. The ones that have captivated us for years. Was it cold-blooded murder, driven by greed? Or was it an act of desperation by 2 young men who felt like they had no other choice? And the abuse, if it's true, does that change how we see things? Does it justify what they did?
Man, those are some tough questions, and there aren't any easy answers.
Nope, not at all. And I think that's why this case, why it still resonates with people. It's about family, it's about violence, and it's about the impact of abuse. It makes us think about those uncomfortable parts of human nature. And it forces us to ask ourselves, what would we do if we were in their shoes?
What would any of us do?